"You shouldn't have laughed," the man whispered. "You just toasted your last moment of peace." The champagne still dripped from her hair. Golden bubbles rolled down the sleeve of her navy uniform, soaking into the fabric, leaving dark trails across her shoulder. The cabin had gone silent except for the hum of twin engines and the faint hiss of carbonation hitting carpet. 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, and Alara Quinn stood frozen in the aisle, drenched, while a dozen pairs of eyes watched her humiliation unfold in real time. Damian Cray held the empty bottle by its neck, that smirk still carved across his face like he'd just won something. He thought it was funny. He thought it was harmless. He thought she was still the same girl who used to wait tables at his father's yacht parties before she walked out on him 2 years ago and never looked back. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. But what Damien didn't know, what nobody in that cabin knew yet, was that the woman dripping champagne onto their luxury floor was married to Luciano de Loren, the man they called Il Fantasma, the ghost, a man so dangerous that people vanished just for saying his name too loud in the wrong room. And he was sitting 6 rows behind her. Alara's hands stayed steady at her sides, even though her pulse hammered in her throat. She didn't wipe her face, didn't flinch, didn't give Damien the satisfaction of seeing her break. The other passengers shifted in their leather seats, some smirking, some uncomfortable, some pretending they hadn't seen anything at all. A woman in pearls looked away. A man in a gray suit cleared his throat and checked his phone. Damien laughed, low, casual, like he just spilled water instead of pouring $1,500 of Dom Perignon over someone's head as a joke. "Come on, lighten up," he said, louder now, playing to the crowd. "It's just champagne. You used to love this stuff, remember?" She remembered. She remembered a lot of things. Like the way he used to correct her grammar in front of his friends. The way he'd introduce her as the girl from Ohio, like it was a punchline. The way she caught him with someone else in their penthouse and still didn't cry because she'd already cried enough over him. But that was before she became a captain, before she met a man who noticed her calm when an engine warning flashed mid-flight and everyone else panicked. Before she married someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make the world listen. Alara finally looked at Damien, really looked at him, and her voice came out steady, cold, professional. "Please take your seat, Mr. Cray. We're experiencing turbulence." But there was no turbulence. Not yet. Behind her, somewhere in the back half of the cabin, she heard the soft rustle of a newspaper being folded. Slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that didn't belong in the middle of laughter and champagne jokes. The air in the cabin changed. It got colder, heavier, like the pressure had dropped even though the altitude hadn't changed at all. Damien still smiled, but his eyes flicked past her shoulder, just for a second, toward the back of the plane. Then he shrugged and dropped into his seat, the bottle clinking as he set it down on the tray table. "Whatever you say, Captain," he muttered, still grinning like he'd gotten away with something. But he hadn't, not even close, because when Alara turned toward the cockpit, she caught a glimpse of her husband in the reflection of the cabin window. Luciano sat perfectly still, his dark suit pressed, his hands folded in his lap. His face showed nothing. No anger, no surprise, nothing at all. But his eyes, those black, unreadable eyes, were locked on Damien like a predator watching prey that didn't know was already dead. Would you have stayed silent or fought back right there? Tell me in the comments before you find out what he did next. Alara Quinn grew up in a house where the faucet dripped all night because fixing it cost money they didn't have. Her father worked double shifts at the auto shop, came home smelling like motor oil and exhaustion. Her mother pulled 12-hour nursing shifts and still found time to pack Alara's lunch every morning before school. They didn't have much, but they had dignity. They taught her that respect wasn't something you begged for. It was something you earned, or you walked away. She was 22 when she met Damien, fresh out of flight school, flying charter planes for executives who barely looked at her when they boarded. He noticed her, though, tall, sharp-dressed, with that easy confidence rich boys are born with. He swept her into a world she'd only seen in movies. Penthouse parties, weekend trips to Monaco, reservations at restaurants that didn't have prices on the menu. For 6 months, it felt like a dream. Then she started noticing the cracks. The way he'd correct her at dinner parties. It's pronounced bruschetta, babe, not bruschetta. The way his friends laughed a little too hard when she told them where she grew up. The way he'd introduce her as my pilot girlfriend, like it was cute instead of impressive. She ignored it at first, told herself he didn't mean it. That love was about compromise, that maybe she was too sensitive. Then she came home early one afternoon and found him in their bed with someone else. A model. Long legs, perfect hair, the kind of woman who fit his world better than Alara ever would. She didn't scream, didn't throw things, didn't beg him to explain. She just packed a bag, walked out, and never answered his calls again. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of rebuilding herself from scratch. She traded the penthouse for a studio apartment, traded designer dresses for uniforms, traded his world for her own, and she swore she'd never let anyone make her feel small again. Then one night in Rome, a man boarded her plane and changed everything. He didn't flirt, didn't stare, didn't ask her name or where she was from. He just sat down, opened a briefcase, and worked in silence while she ran through pre-flight checks. But when an engine warning light flashed 20 minutes into the flight and passengers started whispering in panic, he looked up and watched. Alara didn't panic. She ran diagnostics, rerouted fuel pressure, and had the issue resolved in under 3 minutes. When they landed, the other passengers clapped. The man in the dark suit didn't clap. He just walked past her on his way out and said one sentence. You handle fear like someone who's already met it. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she recognized. Not wealth, not power, something quieter, something heavier. Control. A month later, he requested her as his personal pilot. 6 months after that, she wasn't just flying him anymore. She was sitting across from him at candlelit tables, walking beside him through cities she'd never dreamed of visiting, learning that silence didn't mean weakness, it meant certainty. And a year after that night in Rome, she became Mrs. de Lorraine. She thought she'd left humiliation behind, thought she'd found a life where no one would ever look down on her again. But fate had other plans, because when she checked the passenger manifest for today's flight and saw Damien Cray's name on the list, her hands went cold. She thought she'd left humiliation behind, until fate booked him back into her sky. Luciano de Lorraine didn't raise his voice. He never had to. People who met him for the first time always made the same mistake. They saw the tailored suits, the expensive watches, the quiet manners, and assumed he was just another wealthy businessman. They'd shake his hand, smile, try to impress him with their portfolios or their connections or their plans. And then they'd notice the way other people reacted when he entered a room, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way waiters moved faster, the way security guards stepped aside without being asked. That's when they'd realize their mistake. Luciano de Lorraine wasn't just rich. He was something else entirely. In certain circles, the kind that didn't advertise in magazines or show up on Forbes lists, they called him Il Fantasma, the ghost. Not because he hid in shadows, but because people who crossed him had a habit of disappearing. Businesses collapsed overnight. Bank accounts froze. Investigations suddenly found evidence that hadn't existed the day before, and no one ever saw him coming. Alara hadn't known any of that the night they met. She'd just seen a man who didn't panic when everyone else did. A man who noticed competence instead of appearance. A man who asked her questions about flying instead of asking her out. Their first real conversation happened 3 weeks later, when he requested her for a private flight to Milan. She expected him to work the whole time like most clients did. Instead, he closed his laptop an hour into the flight and asked her a question. Why do you fly? She almost gave him the standard answer, the one about freedom, about loving the sky, about childhood dreams. But something in his tone made her tell the truth instead. Because up here, nobody can tell me who I'm supposed to be. He'd looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, like he understood exactly what she meant. After that, he requested her for every flight. London, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Zurich. She learned that he rarely spoke unless he had something important to say, that he noticed details most people missed, the way she adjusted her grip on the yoke when crosswinds hit, the way she stayed calm, when air traffic control rerouted them mid-flight. And she learned that the stories people whispered about him, the ones about power and fear and consequences, were true. But with her, he was different. He never demanded, never expected, never made her feel like she owed him anything. When he proposed, he didn't do it with roses or champagne or some grand gesture. He did it over coffee in a quiet cafe in Vienna, watching the rain through the window. "I don't want to change you," he'd said. "I just want to stand beside you while you keep being exactly who you are." She'd said yes without hesitation, because Luciano de Lorraine was the first man who ever made her feel like she didn't have to shrink herself to fit into his world. And that night in Rome, when she'd handled that engine warning without flinching, she had no idea she'd just earned the respect of the most dangerous man she'd ever meet. And that night in Rome, she had no idea she'd married the kind of man whose silence was deadlier than most men's rage. Alara stared at the passenger manifest on her tablet screen and felt her stomach drop. Damien Cray. Seat 4B. The name sat there in black text like a curse she couldn't unsay. She read it 3 times, hoping she'd misread, hoping it was a different Damien Cray, hoping the universe wasn't cruel enough to put her ex-boyfriend on the same flight as her husband. But it was him. She knew it was him. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the tablet down on the cockpit console. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear the ground crew loading luggage into the cargo hold, hear the boarding stairs being rolled into position, hear the first passengers starting to arrive. She took a breath, steadied herself. She'd flown through thunderstorms and engine failures and emergency landings. She could handle seeing an ex-boyfriend for 3 hours. But when Damien stepped through the cabin door, everything she'd told herself evaporated. He looked exactly the same. Same sharp suit, same perfect hair, same arrogant walk like he owned whatever room he entered. He handed his coat to the flight attendant without looking at her, already scanning the cabin like he was ranking everyone by net worth. Then he saw Alara. His eyes widened. Then that smile, the one she used to find charming before she learned what it really meant, spread across his face. "No way," he said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Alara Quinn. Or wait, do you go by Captain Quinn now?" She kept her expression neutral. Professional. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cray. Please take your seat. We'll be departing shortly." But he didn't move. Just stood there in the aisle, blocking other passengers, grinning like he'd found something entertaining. "Guess some of us really do move up in the world," he said. "Last time I saw you, you were flying charters for corporate nobodies. Now you're on the executive jets. Good for you." The way he said it, like he was proud of her, like he'd had something to do with it, made her jaw tighten. "Your seat is 4B, sir." He finally moved, but not before leaning in close enough that she could smell his cologne. The same one he used to wear, the one that used to make her heart race for all the wrong reasons. "We should catch up after we land," he said quietly. "For old time's sake." She didn't answer, just turned back toward the cockpit and closed the door behind her. But through the small window, she could see him settling into his seat, still smiling, already starting a conversation with the passenger beside him. She watched him gesture toward the cockpit, watched the other man laugh, watched Damien lean back like he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. And further back, 6 rows behind Damien, Luciano sat perfectly still in his usual seat. Dark suit, folded hands, unreadable expression. But his eyes followed Damien's reflection in the window, tracking every movement, every gesture, every word. Alara's co-pilot glanced at her. "You good, Captain?" She nodded, flipped switches, ran through pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. "I'm fine," she said. But she wasn't, because she'd just seen the way her husband's jaw tightened when Damien leaned too close to her. Just for a second. Just enough. And anyone who knew Luciano de Lorraine knew what that meant. It meant the clock had started. It meant someone had just made a mistake they didn't know how to take back. What she didn't see was the way Luciano's eyes followed Damien's reflection in the window. Have you ever met someone from your past when you least expected it? Drop a comment below. This story's about to turn icy. The flight leveled out at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs clicked off with a soft chime that echoed through the cabin. Alara stayed in the cockpit, running system checks she'd already run twice, Anything to keep her mind off the fact that Damian Cray was sitting 30 feet behind her, probably still smiling. She could hear the murmur of conversation through the door. The clink of glassware as the flight attendant prepared drinks. The low hum of engines that usually calmed her, but today just felt like tension building in her chest. Then she heard Damian's voice, louder than it needed to be. "A toast," he announced. Alara's hands froze on the controls. Through the cockpit door's small window, she could see him standing in the aisle, champagne glass raised, that same arrogant grin plastered across his face. The other passengers looked up, some curious, some annoyed at the interruption, some already smiling like they were in on whatever joke was coming. "To all the people who forget where they came from," Damian said, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Especially the ones who are flying planes now instead of sitting in them." A few passengers laughed, awkward, uncertain laughter that said they didn't quite get the joke but didn't want to seem out of touch. Alara's co-pilot glanced at her. "Want me to handle that?" She shook her head. Damian was just being Damian. Loud, obnoxious, harmless. But then he grabbed the champagne bottle from the attendant's cart. "Oh, come on, don't be like that," he called toward the cockpit. "You used to love this stuff." He popped the cork, loud, sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. And before anyone could stop him, he pushed open the cockpit door and poured the entire bottle over Alara's head. The champagne hit her hair first, cold, shocking, soaking through instantly. It ran down her face, dripped off her chin, soaked into the shoulders of her uniform. Bubbles fizzed against her skin. The liquid pooled in her lap, darkened the fabric of her sleeves, dripped onto the control panel. The cabin went silent. Not the polite kind of silence. The kind where everyone stopped breathing at the same time. Alara sat perfectly still. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't wipe her face. Just stared straight ahead at the instrument panel while champagne dripped from her hair onto the floor. Damian laughed. High, sharp, like he just pulled off the prank of the century. "Relax, it's just a joke. No harm done, right?" But nobody else was laughing anymore. The passengers sat frozen in their seats, eyes wide, some with hands halfway to their mouths like they couldn't believe what they'd just seen. The flight attendant stood in the aisle with a drink cart, her face pale. And in the back of the cabin, Luciano de Loren slowly folded his newspaper. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. He sat on the seat beside him with deliberate care. Then he stood. The temperature in the cabin dropped. Not literally, but everyone felt it. The shift in the air. The weight that suddenly pressed down on every conversation, every breath, every thought. Damian finally seemed to notice. He turned, still holding the empty bottle, his smile faltering just slightly when he saw the man walking toward him. Luciano moved slowly. Each step measured, precise. His expression showed nothing. No anger, no surprise, no emotion at all. But his eyes were black fire. He stopped 3 feet from Damian and said nothing for a long moment. Just looked at him the way a doctor might look at a patient who didn't know they were already dying. Then he spoke, quiet, calm, almost gentle. "You think humiliation is entertainment?" Damian laughed nervously, still try to play it off. "Hey man, it was just a joke. We used to date. She knows I'm just messing around." "You didn't ask who she was," Luciano interrupted, his voice dropping even quieter. "That's the problem." The cabin felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls were closing in. One of Luciano's men, a broad-shouldered figure in a dark suit, stood up from his seat near the back. Then another. They didn't move toward Damian. Didn't need to. Just stood there, silent, waiting. Damian's smile vanished. "Look, I didn't know she was your." "You didn't ask," Luciano repeated. "You saw a woman. You decided she was beneath you. You humiliated her in front of strangers because you thought it would be funny." He took one step closer. "Do you still think it's funny?" Damian opened his mouth, closed it, looked around the cabin like someone might help him. Nobody moved. Luciano turned to Alara, his voice softening just slightly. "My love, step outside, please." Alara's hands trembled as she finally wiped champagne from her eyes. "Luciano, don't." "Trust me," he said quietly. "This is just turbulence." She stood slowly, champagne dripping from her uniform onto the floor. She walked past Damien, without looking at him, past the frozen passengers, toward the small galley at the back of the plane. The cockpit door closed behind her, and for 10 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Luciano smiled, small, cold like winter settling in. "Sit down, Mr. Cray," he said softly. "We're going to have a conversation about respect." When he spoke, the cabin turned colder than the champagne. Damien's knees buckled before he even realized he was sitting down. Luciano stood over him, hands clasped loosely in front of his waist, head tilted slightly like he was studying something under glass. The other passengers had gone statues still, some staring, some pretending to look at their phones, all of them hyper-aware that they were watching something they probably shouldn't be watching. "Let me tell you a story," Luciano said quietly. His voice barely carried past the third row, but somehow everyone heard it. There was once a man who thought power meant doing whatever he wanted. He thought wealth gave him permission. He thought consequences were for other people. Damien tried to smile. It came out crooked, weak. "Look, I already said I didn't know she was." "You're not listening." Luciano's tone didn't change. Still calm, still soft, but the words landed like stones. "I'm not angry that you disrespected my wife. I'm disappointed that you disrespected a woman at all." He took one step closer. Damien pressed back into his seat. "You poured champagne on her head because you thought it would make you look clever. Make your friends laugh. Make her remember that you once had power over her." Luciano paused. Did it work? Damien's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I'll tell you what happened instead." Luciano continued. "You showed everyone in this cabin exactly who you are. A man so insecure that he needs to humiliate women to feel important. A boy pretending to be dangerous because he's never actually met danger." One of Luciano's men shifted position near the back galley. Just a subtle movement, but it made 3 passengers flinch. Damien's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I was just messing around, man. We used to date. She knows I didn't mean anything by it." "She knows," Luciano agreed. "She knows you're the kind of man who corrects a woman's pronunciation at dinner parties, who introduces her by where she's from instead of what she does, who cheats and then acts surprised when she leaves." Damien went pale. "How do you?" "Because she told me everything," Luciano said simply. "And unlike you, I listened." The cabin felt smaller now, tighter, like all the oxygen had been sucked toward the emergency exits. Luciano crouched down, slowly, deliberately, until he was eye level with Damien. When he spoke again, his voice dropped so low that only Damien and the passengers in the nearest seats could hear. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit in this chair for the rest of the flight. You're not going to speak. You're not going to move. You're not going to look at my wife again. And when we land, you're going to walk off this plane and never forget what almost happened here." "What?" Damien's voice shook. "What almost happened?" Luciano smiled. "Not the warm kind. The kind that made grown men reconsider their choices. You almost found out what I do to people who hurt the only person in this world I care about." He stood up, brushed an invisible piece of lint off his sleeve, and turned toward the back galley where Alara stood with her arms wrapped around herself, champagne still drying in her hair. His voice softened immediately. "My love, come here." She walked toward him slowly, eyes red but dry, jaw set. When she reached him, he took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders without a word. Then he turned back to Damien one last time. "Oh, and Mr. Cray, that shipping contract your father's been negotiating with the Vostok Group? Consider it canceled. Effective immediately." Damien's face went from pale to gray. "You can't. That's a $200 million deal." "Could have been," Luciano corrected. "But I just made a phone call during boarding. Funny how these things work out." He guided Alara back toward his seat, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, and didn't look at Damien again. The cabin stayed silent for the rest of the flight. And when the door closed behind her, the cabin became the quietest place on Earth. If you believe some lessons can only be learned the hard way, drop a comment right now. Alara sat in the passenger seat beside Luciano, his jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, her hair slowly drying into stiff, champagne-scented waves. She stared out the window at clouds that looked like cotton pulled apart, trying not to think about Damien sitting 6 rows ahead, probably still shaking. Luciano read a book, or pretended to. She could tell he wasn't actually turning pages, just holding it open while his mind worked through whatever calculations men like him always ran in the background. She wanted to ask what he'd said, wanted to know what happened in those 10 minutes after she left the cabin. But part of her already knew the answer. Nothing violent, nothing loud, just words. Quiet, precise words that probably replayed in Damien's head every time he closed his eyes. The flight attendant approached carefully, like she was walking through a minefield. "Can I get either of you anything?" "Water," Ilaris said. Her voice came out hoarse. "Two," Luciano added without looking up from his book. When the attendant left, Ilara finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. I can handle Damien. I've handled worse." Luciano closed the book and set it on the armrest between them. We looked at her. His eyes were softer than they'd been in the aisle, still serious, but gentler. "I know you can handle him, but you shouldn't have to. Not on your own plane. Not while you're working. Not ever." She looked down at her hands, still damp with champagne residue. "People are going to talk. Let them. They're going to say you overreacted. Let them say that too." He reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "The only opinion that matters to me is yours. And if you think I went too far, tell me now." She thought about it, really thought about it. About Damien's face when Luciano stood up. About the fear in his eyes when he realized he'd made a mistake he couldn't undo. About how small he looked sitting in that chair, all his arrogance stripped away in under 2 minutes. And she thought about the years before Luciano, the nights she'd cried in bathroom stalls at parties, the times she'd laughed off insults that cut deeper than anyone knew, the moments she'd swallowed her pride because fighting back felt more exhausting than staying quiet. "No," she said finally. "You didn't go too far." Luciano squeezed her hand once, then let go and picked up his book again. They didn't speak for the rest of the flight. But when they landed in New York 3 hours later, Ilara watched through the cockpit window as 2 of Luciano's men escorted Damien off the plane. He moved like someone sleepwalking, stiff, mechanical, eyes straight ahead. He didn't look back, didn't say goodbye to the other passengers, just walked down the stairs and into a waiting car that disappeared into Manhattan traffic before anyone could ask questions. The other passengers filed out slowly, quiet, avoiding eye contact with each other like they'd all witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. When the cabin finally emptied, Ilara stood in the aisle where Damien had poured champagne on her head 3 hours ago. The carpet still showed a dark stain where the liquid had soaked in. She stared at it for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. Luciano waited for her at the bottom of the stairs, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone to his ear. When he saw her, he ended the call without saying goodbye. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. They walked across the tarmac side by side, and neither of them mentioned Damien Cray again. And from that day, Damien Cray never boarded another plane again. 3 weeks later, the first article appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Cray shipping under federal investigation. Allegations of fraud, tax evasion surface. Ilara saw it on her phone during a layover in Dubai. She read the headline twice, then set the phone face down on the table and stirred her coffee without drinking it. Luciano sat across from her, reviewing contracts on his tablet. He didn't look up, didn't comment, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, just barely, just for a second. The investigation moved fast. Faster than normal investigations usually moved. Within days, auditors found discrepancies in shipping manifests dating back 5 years. Cargo that never existed. Payments to shell companies that dissolved the moment anyone looked too closely. Tax filings that didn't match customs records. And the banks got involved. Cray Shipping's accounts froze overnight. Lines of credit vanished. Investors pulled out. Partners canceled contracts. The company that Damien's grandfather had built from nothing, that had survived recessions and scandals and 3 generations of family drama, collapsed in under 2 weeks. By the end of the month, Damien's father gave a press conference announcing bankruptcy. Damien himself disappeared. No social media posts, no public appearances, no statements to the press. People who knew him said he'd moved to his mother's family estate in Connecticut, away from cameras and questions and the wreckage of everything his last name used to mean. Alara watched it all unfold from a distance, the way you might watch a building burn on the horizon, close enough to see the smoke, far enough that the heat didn't reach you. She never asked Luciano if he had anything to do with it, and he never told her. But one evening, while they sat on the balcony of their Lake Como villa watching the sun sink into the mountains, she said quietly, "The Cray family lost everything." Luciano swirled wine in his glass, eyes on the horizon. They lost what they thought they had. There's a difference. Damien's father built that company from nothing, and his son destroyed it by forgetting that respect isn't negotiable. Luciano glanced at her. "Would you rather I had done nothing?" She thought about that flight, about standing in the aisle with champagne dripping from her hair while strangers watched, about Damien's laugh echoing through the cabin like she was still the girl he could dismiss whenever he felt like it. "No," she said, "I wouldn't." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light change from gold to pink to deep purple. "People are going to connect the dots eventually," Alara said. "They're going to figure out what happened on that plane. Let them." Luciano set his glass down. "Let them tell the story however they want. The only version that matters is the one we know." And the story did spread, quietly at first, then louder. Whispers at country clubs and boardrooms and private parties. The flight where the ghost smiled. The ex-boyfriend who crossed the wrong woman. The champagne that cost a family fortune. Nobody knew the exact details. Nobody could prove anything. But everyone agreed on one thing. You didn't disrespect Hilaire de Lorraine and walk away unchanged. And slowly, carefully, the world learned a new rule. The kind of rule that didn't need to be written down because everyone understood it anyway. Some people were protected, not by laws or contracts or public opinion, by something quieter, something more absolute, by a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make empires crumble. Alara realized that sometimes silence isn't peace. It's power. If you believe karma always finds its way, hit that like button right now. The sunset over Lake Como turned the water into liquid gold, the same color as the champagne that had started everything. Alara stood at the villa's stone railing, watching light ripple across the surface, and wondered if Damien ever thought about that flight. If he replayed it in his head the way she sometimes did. If he understood yet what he'd actually lost that day. Luciano joined her at the railing, 2 glasses of sparkling water in his hands. He'd stopped drinking champagne after the incident. Not because she asked, but because he noticed she couldn't look at it anymore without remembering. "You're quiet," he said, handing her a glass. "Just thinking about." She took a sip, watched the bubbles rise. "Whether I should feel guilty." He didn't answer right away, just stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and looked out at the lake. "Do you?" he asked finally. "Sometimes." She traced the rim of her glass with one finger. "Damien was cruel, arrogant. He humiliated me in front of strangers because he thought it was funny. But his whole family lost everything because of one stupid moment." "No," Luciano said quietly. "His family lost everything because of years of fraud and corruption. I just made sure the right people started looking. But you wouldn't have looked if he hadn't. If he hadn't shown me exactly who he was." Luciano turned to face her. "You're right. I wouldn't have. But that doesn't make what I found any less real." She met his eyes. "So it was justice, not revenge. Does it matter?" "Yes," she said. "It matters to me." Luciano set his glass down and took both her hands in his. "Then let me ask you something. If I had done nothing, if I had sat there while he poured champagne on your head and laughed, would you have respected me?" She opened her mouth to say yes, then stopped. "Because the truth was more complicated than that. I would have understood," she said slowly. "But no, I wouldn't have respected it. And if I had hit him, if I made it physical, violent, loud, I would have been horrified." "Exactly." He squeezed her hands gently. "So I did the only thing that made sense. I protected you without destroying myself. I taught him consequences without becoming the monster people already think I am. And yes, maybe I went further than strictly necessary. Maybe the investigation would have stayed buried if I hadn't made those phone calls. But men like Damien don't learn from warnings. They learn from loss." The sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky bruised, purple, and deep blue. Do you regret it? Alara asked. No. No hesitation. I regret that it happened at all. I regret that you had to experience that humiliation. But I don't regret making sure he understood the weight of his choices. She looked down at their joined hands. People say you're dangerous. I am. They say you make people disappear. Sometimes I do. But you've never hurt me. I never will. He lifted one hand to her face, thumb brushing her cheek. You're the line I don't cross. The one thing in this world that makes me want to be better than what I am. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing. I didn't need revenge. I just wanted to move on. I know, he whispered, but you deserved more than silence. You deserved someone who would stand up when standing up mattered. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in twilight and each other, while the lake went dark below them. And somewhere in Connecticut, Damian Cray probably couldn't sleep, probably stared at ceilings and wondered how one bottle of champagne had cost him everything he thought was permanent. But here, in this moment, Alara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. She realized justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Power reveals character. That's what Alara's father used to say, back when she was young enough to think powerful people were always good. Before she learned that money and influence didn't make you kind. They just gave you more ways to show who you really were underneath. Damian Cray's power revealed arrogance. A man so used to getting away with cruelty that he forgot cruelty had consequences. A boy who never grew up because nobody ever made him. Luciano de Loren's power revealed restraint. A man who could have destroyed Damian in 100 different ways, but chose the one that taught instead of tortured. Who understood that real strength wasn't about how much damage you could do. It was about knowing when to stop. And Alara Quinn's power, the quiet kind that didn't announce itself, revealed grace. The ability to stand in the middle of humiliation and not break. To marry danger without becoming dangerous. To forgive without forgetting. 3 people, 1 flight, 1 choice that changed everything. The story spread through elite circles like smoke. Impossible to contain, impossible to verify, impossible to forget. The flight where the ghost protected his queen. The champagne that cost a fortune. The ex-boyfriend who learned too late that some women are protected by more than just themselves. People told different versions depending on who was listening. Some said Luciano threatened violence. Some said he never raised his voice. Some said Damian deserved worse. Some said the whole thing was an overreaction. But everyone agreed on one thing. You don't touch what belongs to Il Fantasma. Except Alara didn't belong to him. Not really. She stood beside him, walked beside him, chose him every day the same way he chose her. And that partnership built on mutual respect instead of ownership was more terrifying to men like Damian than any threat could ever be. Because it meant there were women in the world who didn't need saving, who could save themselves, who simply chose partners strong enough to stand beside them when the world got ugly. And it meant there were men in the world who understood that protecting someone wasn't about control. It was about making sure they never had to fight battles beneath them. 6 months after the incident, Alara flew a tech CEO to Singapore. During the flight, a passenger made a joke about women pilots. Nothing cruel. Nothing aggressive, just a casual comment that landed wrong. The CEO, a woman Alara had never met before, stood up immediately. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? She said, her voice ice sharp. I want to make sure I heard you correctly. The passenger backtracked, apologized, spent the rest of the flight silent. When they landed, the CEO stopped by the cockpit. I heard about what happened to you, she said quietly. The champagne, the husband. All of it. And I just want you to know, some of us are paying attention. Some of us learned. Alara nodded, smiled, watched the woman walk away, and realized that maybe the story spreading wasn't such a bad thing after all. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't personal. It's cultural. It's making sure the next woman doesn't have to experience what you did. It's teaching the world that humiliation has consequences even when you think nobody's watching. The sun rose over Lake Como the morning Alara told this story out loud for the first time. Luciano listened without interrupting, his hand resting over hers on the breakfast table. When she finished, he said only one thing. "Do you regret how it ended?" She thought about Damien's company collapsing, about his family's name disappearing from business journals, about the life he used to have before one bottle of champagne changed everything. "No," she said, "I don't, because some lessons can only be learned through loss. And some men only respect women after they've seen what happens when they don't. The next time you think humiliation is harmless, remember this flight. Remember the woman who stood still while champagne dripped from her hair. Remember the husband who taught consequences without raising his voice. Remember the empire that fell because someone forgot that dignity isn't negotiable. And remember that sometimes the person you're mocking is loved by someone who moves mountains with whispers." The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after the Lake Como conversation. Alara was reviewing flight schedules in her home office when her phone buzzed. The sender name made her pause mid-scroll, Cray D. She stared at it for a full minute before opening it. The message was short. No greeting. No explanation. Just 4 sentences that felt like they'd been rewritten 100 times before he finally hit send. "I've been in therapy for 2 months now. My therapist asked me to write letters to people I've hurt. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what I took from you that day." Alara read it 3 times. Then she walked downstairs to where Luciano sat reading the morning paper, coffee steaming beside him. "Damien sent me an email," she said. Luciano's eyes flicked up from the financial section. He didn't tense, didn't move, just waited. She handed him the phone, watched his face while he read. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, something closer to evaluation. Like he was calculating odds on an equation only he could see. "What do you want to do?" he asked, handing the phone back. "I don't know." She sat down across from him. "Part of me wants to delete it and pretend I never saw it. Part of me thinks maybe he actually learned something. And the rest of you?" She traced the edge of her coffee mug. "The rest of me wonders if it matters. If his growth changes what happened. If an apology 3 months too late means anything at all." Luciano folded the paper and set it aside. "Do you want my opinion, or do you want me to listen?" "Both." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. Men like Damien don't change because they want to. They change because they have to. He lost everything. His company, his reputation, his sense of untouchable privilege. That kind of loss either destroys you or rebuilds you. The question isn't whether he's sorry. The question is whether his sorry matters to you. Alara looked out the window at their garden, where morning light caught in the fountain spray and turned it into diamonds. "When I was with him, I used to apologize for things that weren't my fault. For being too loud at parties. For not understanding jokes that weren't funny. For wanting things he thought were beneath me. And now I don't apologize for taking up space." She looked back at him. So no, his apology doesn't change anything. But maybe it changes him. And maybe that's enough. She deleted the email without responding. Luciano watched her do it, then stood and kissed the top of her head. "Proud of you. For deleting an email. For knowing the difference between forgiveness and closure." He picked up his coffee. One requires their participation. The other is just you deciding you're done carrying their weight. 2 weeks later, Alara heard through mutual acquaintances that Damien had started volunteering at a women's shelter in Hartford, teaching resume workshops, helping with job interviews. Small things, quiet things. She didn't reach out, didn't acknowledge it. But late one night, when Luciano asked if she'd heard, she nodded. "Good," she said simply. Because some apologies aren't meant to be accepted. They're meant to be lived, to become actions instead of words. To prove that the person who hurt you learned something even if you never speak to them again. And sometimes the best revenge isn't watching someone suffer. It's watching them become better and knowing you don't need their growth to validate your worth. Alara slept well that night, better than she had in months. Because closure doesn't require conversation. Sometimes it just requires deciding that someone else's journey is no longer your responsibility to witness. Sometimes healing isn't about the apology you receive. It's about the peace you give yourself. Have you ever received an apology that came too late? Tell us in the comments how you handled it. Your story might help someone else find their peace. 1 year after the Champagne incident, Alara was invited to speak at a women's aviation conference in Chicago. She almost said no. Public speaking had never been her strength, and the topic they wanted her to address, navigating respect in male-dominated industries, felt too close to wounds that had only recently scarred over. But the organizer was persistent. "We've heard your story," the woman said over the phone. "Not the tabloid version, the real one. And we think other women need to hear it too." So Alara said yes. The conference hall held 300 women, pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, engineers. Women who'd spent careers being called sweetheart and honey and told to smile more. Women who'd mastered the art of laughing off comments that cut deep. Women who knew exactly what it felt like to have champagne poured on their heads in 100 different metaphorical ways. Alara stood at the podium, hands steady on either side of the microphone, and told them everything. She told them about Damien, about the years she spent making herself smaller to fit into his world, about the moment she realized love shouldn't require shrinking, about walking away with nothing but her dignity and rebuilding from there. She told them about the flight, about standing in that aisle, soaked and humiliated while strangers watched, about the choice she made not to fight back, not to scream, not to give him the reaction he wanted. And she told them about Luciano, not the myth, not the ghost, just the man who taught her that protection doesn't mean control. That real partnership means standing beside someone, not in front of them. "I didn't need him to save me," she said, her voice carrying to the back rows. "I needed him to witness, to see what happened and decide it mattered, to use his power not to fight my battles, but to make sure I never had to fight beneath my worth again." The room was silent, not uncomfortable silence, the kind where everyone's breathing synchronized. "Some people think what happened after was revenge," Alara continued. "That my husband destroyed a man's life over a bottle of champagne. But here's what they don't understand. That champagne was never the point. It was the years of small cruelties, the accumulated weight of being treated like I was less than, the final public declaration that my dignity was entertainment." She paused, took a breath. "And what Luciano did wasn't revenge. It was consequence. He didn't invent the fraud, didn't fabricate the corruption. He just made sure the right people looked. Because men like Damien don't exist in a vacuum. They're enabled by systems that forgive their cruelty and punish our reactions to it." A woman in the third row started clapping. Then another. Then the entire room rose in standing ovation that lasted 2 full minutes. Afterward, dozens of women approached her, each with their own story, their own champagne moment, their own version of being made small by someone who thought their power was permission. One woman, a helicopter pilot named Shanice, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "I've been flying for 15 years, she said quietly. "And last month, a passenger grabbed my waist during boarding and said, 'Sweetheart, are you sure you're old enough to fly this thing?' I laughed it off, filed away with all the other moments I've laughed off. But hearing you tonight," her voice cracked. Alara took her hand. "You don't have to laugh it off anymore," Alara said. "None of us do." That night, in her hotel room, Alara called Luciano, told him about the speech, about the women who'd share their stories, about how strange it felt to be standing on the other side of trauma, speaking about it like a lesson instead of a wound. "You gave them permission," he said. "Permission for what? To stop pretending it doesn't hurt, to stop making themselves smaller so other people feel comfortable, to demand the respect they've always deserved." He paused. "That's more powerful than anything I did on that plane." She smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "We make a good team. The best," he agreed. 6 months later, the aviation conference started a mentorship program called the Champagne Initiative, a name that made Alara laugh and cry at the same time. It paired young women entering aviation with veterans who'd navigated the same hostile spaces, who'd learned to demand respect without apologizing for it, who understood that sometimes the best way to change an industry is to refuse to accept its worst behaviors as normal. Alara became a mentor, not because she had all the answers, but because she'd learned the most important one. Your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. It's determined by how you refuse to accept less than you deserve. And slowly, story by story, woman by woman, the culture started shifting. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough that young pilots graduating flight school heard fewer jokes about their gender and more questions about their qualifications. Enough that respect stopped being something you had to earn through silence and became something you could demand through presence. Enough that champagne stayed in glasses instead of being weaponized against dignity. Because change doesn't happen through one dramatic moment. It happens through 1,000 small decisions to stop accepting what's always been accepted. If this story inspired you to stand up for someone or for yourself, drop a comment sharing how. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that empower, uplift, and remind us all that our voices matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Together, we're not just telling stories, we're changing them. See you in the next one, where real courage meets real consequences.